I'm Dr. Tita Banks, former chair of UNAUSA and president of the International Forum. It's my pleasure to be with you for this dialogue on ensuring quality education in the times of COVID-19, especially on this first annual UN International Day to protect education from attack. The pandemic has created the largest disruption to education in history, and prolonged school closures could further entrench inequalities in access to learning. The United Nations estimates that the pandemic has affected more than 1 billion students worldwide. Even before the pandemic began, the world's children were already facing a learning crisis, with more than 250 million school-age children out of school. Only a quarter of secondary school children in developing countries were leaving school with basic skills. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has stated, quote, "As the world faces unsustainable levels of inequality, we need education, the great equalizer, more than ever," end quote. Across the globe, educators and the United Nations are working to give all people access to a quality education by 2030. This is part of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. During this session, we will explore how UN agencies and US educators are planning for the future of school during the pandemic, and what long-term lessons can be learned. We are honored to have our 4 guest speakers who will each discuss how they are working to provide quality education and address issues such as inequalities, technology access, teacher training, and student learning. Afterwards, there will be time for questions and answers from the audience. If you have questions at any time, please type them into the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of your screen on your navigation bar. Selected questions will be addressed by our panel as time permits. Please note that the chat box will not be monitored, but you can access a link for speaker bios within the chat box. Now it is my honor to introduce our speakers, who will each provide a brief overview of their organization and work. Our first introduction is of Dr. Sobi Talwil, Director of Future of Learning and Innovation, UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Dr. Tawil.
Thank you very much, and very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Education, we're all involved in education. I have professionally been involved in education for some 35 years, 20 of those with UNESCO. And UNESCO, as was mentioned, is mandated in the areas of education, science, and culture, but specifically in the area of education, it's the specialized UN agency mandated to lead on Sustainable Development Goal number 4 around education, ensuring equitable, quality education and lifelong learning for all. So mandated to lead, and lead involves several functions, and I'll just name a few and give you some examples. One is to coordinate at the global level, to coordinate Sustainable Development Goal 4. UNESCO did lead the shaping of Sustainable Development Goal 4 in the consultations that led to the adoption of the 2030 Agenda. In leading, UNESCO also monitors and reports on progress against the commitments and the goals and the targets set. And we do have an annual global education monitoring report that many of you might be familiar with. There's also thought leadership, and currently it's currently an initiative around the futures of education. So it is moments where UNESCO also looks at particular historical junctures of transformation, looks at the longer term development horizon, a vision of what kind of society we're aspiring towards, and implications for education. Finally, just to say that UNESCO does have a network of regional and national offices on the ground. And the work is typically what we call upstream work. It's really supports education policy and planning essentially. We're not a donor agency. and often referred to actually as an intellectual agency where knowledge generation, brokering, knowledge exchange is really at the heart of all the functions of UNESCO.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Tawil. Our next panelist that will be introduced is Ms. Caitlin Mckern, Deputy Director of Global Programs and Field Engagement with UNICEF USA, or the United Nations International Emergency Children's Fund. Ms. Mckern.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me today. I'm the Deputy Director of Global Programs at UNICEF USA, which is a national committee of UNICEF. So we work to support UNICEF through fundraising, advocacy, and education, and support the mission of UNICEF, which is really to uphold the rights of children around the world. UNICEF works in 190 countries and territories. And my portfolio is focused on education and early childhood development. So I provide kind of a liaison role between our UNICEF colleagues in countries around the world and at headquarters, and our development colleagues within the United States and our 9 regional offices in the United States. And we support UNICEF's education goals. UNICEF is currently working on education programming in 144 countries, focusing very much on improving the quality of education, improving access to education for the most vulnerable children, and ensuring that children everywhere, especially in times of crisis, as well as in development contexts, have access to quality learning opportunities.
Oh, Tita, you're muted.
I'm sorry, okay. Our next panelist is Mr. Assalam Deeb, Lebanon Chief of Education, UN Relief and Works Agency.
Thank you, and thank the United Nations Association actually for inviting me to be a panelist here. United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, is a UN agency that supports the relief and the human development of the Palestinian refugees. UNRWA was established in 1949 after the conflict of 1948 to provide relief and to provide support to the Palestinian refugees. Today, UNRWA has more than 500,000 students distributed in 5 fields: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Gaza, and West Bank, with running more than 700 schools. UNRWA's mandate is to provide equality, equitable, and inclusive education to cover the basic education cycle. Only in Lebanon, UNRWA provides secondary education, and this is due to the restrictions of accessibility to the Palestinian refugees here to the public schools, and the vulnerability of the Palestinian refugees does not allow them to have their children in private schools, actually, due to the high cost of fees. Now, in Lebanon, we have 65 schools providing education to around 37,000 students, among which we have 5,000 PRS, Palestinian refugees coming from Syria after the Syrian crisis in 2012. Now, UNRWA has its own strategies, has its own policies actually that coordinate with partners. UNRWA relies on the international contributions through its program budget and also through generous donations to run all of its services, other than education, the relief, as I mentioned, and the health. Now, UNRWA also, just to mention, started an education reform in 2011, focusing on the education in emergencies. So UNRWA has a resilient education system that responds to crisis, whatever the crisis is, we experienced a lot of security situation in the region, particularly in Lebanon, that the education system has been resilient to cope with this crisis and to provide equitable education and quality education. And recently the COVID that colleagues mentioned, actually that imposes a lot of unprecedented challenges actually to the world, including Lebanon and UNRWA. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we were waiting for one other panelist, but when she does join us, we will thread her right in. So thank you for your remarks. It's important that we know these organizations because they are the ones standing up and standing in the gap in these critical times for the universal right to quality education, certainly protected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Before we progress to our questions and answers segment, we would like for you, the audience, to participate in a brief poll as a snapshot of our attendees at this webinar. So I'm going to turn it over to Anna Mahalik of our UNA staff. Anna?
Hello, everyone. We're really excited to get to know who is on this call today. So we have a couple quick questions for you that should have just popped up on your screen. We hope that you will take the time to answer them quickly so that we can get a sense of who is on our call today. We'd love to know what region you are calling in from. We know we have UNA USA chapters from all across the country and many non-UNA USA members who are joining us for the first time. And we'd love to get to know where you're calling in from. And we'd also love to know what type of education level you are associated with, if you are an educator. And if you're not an educator, you know, just to know that you're here today and that you're passionate about education issues would be really wonderful to know as well. And I'm starting to see we have a lot of folks who are here who are very passionate about education issues and how they can support the UN's work on education. I'll just give it about 5 more seconds for everyone to get their answer in, and then I will share the results with everyone before we move on to our next segment. So I'm ending the polling and I'm going to share the results. We see that many people are calling in from the East Coast today, but we also have a nice mix from across the country and outside of the US. And we do have many folks who are working with students at a university level, perhaps they're university professors or university administrators. And again, many who are also working with education nonprofits and interested in education issues. So thank you everyone for sharing that. We also just quickly would love to know, the impact of COVID-19 on your community and on education. Obviously, today's panel is very much focused on the impact of COVID on education, and whether you're in a classroom or not, many of you have been focusing on what's going on in your local communities and how local classrooms and school systems are adapting during this time. We'd love to know how you feel about your community's preparedness to resume in classroom learning this fall. We'd also love to know in what ways COVID-19 might have impacted you personally, and you can select all that apply. We know that this has impacted us all in different ways and impacted children in many different ways. And so we're very curious to get a sense of where our audience stands on these issues as we'll be discussing them throughout the rest of the panel. And we almost have over half of our audience who've responded so far. And in 5 seconds, I will share the results. We can see here that many people actually do feel that their community is moderately prepared for in-classroom learning this fall. And many people feel like COVID has affected their emotional well-being, mental health, their work, and as well as, equally physical health, education, and financial well-being. So we know that this
Anna?
I think my computer froze, but
Okay.
was everyone able to see the results?
Okay. Good. All right. Well, you know how that goes, but thank you so much for participating in the polling. And it gives us an idea of our backgrounds, experience we're bringing, our concerns and turns into this discussion. I am pleased to announce that we have our final panelist joining us, Ms. Randi Weingarten, President of the American Federation of Teachers. A very busy day to you, Ms. Weingarten, but thank you so much for joining us. If you could turn your, unmute and just give us a brief introduction before we go into our discussion questions, just about yourself and the organ and AFT. Thank you.
So, you know, and this is, you know, in the last few minutes, I, like so many other people, have experienced the travails of remote work.
Okay, I think
device that I'm able to use through cellular. But, you know, this is part of, you know, why this is not normal for all of us. So I'm the head of a 1.7 million union that represents nurses and teachers throughout America. And, you know, most of our members have been very much involved on a day-to-day basis with the impacts of COVID, from working in hospitals when one didn't know what the virus really meant, and to trying to prepare for schools right now after, in March, basically stopping everything in a nanosecond to try to stand up remote education. But we are, we represent a lot of people who work with real at-risk populations all throughout America. And I spent my last 2 days actually in New York as teachers were going back to school to start thinking. The schools have been delayed in New York, as they should have, but start thinking about how to reopen in-person learning and doing basically blended learning in a period of time with very few resources and very little guidance.
I think
Be doing everything we can to ensure that we protect people and we keep school and schooling safe, but that we try to do whatever we can to stand up learning, whether it's remotely or whether it's in-person hybrid model.
Great. Well, thank you for all you're doing and for taking the time out, especially as many of the schools are opening today. So we're anticipating a lot more discussion, especially nationally here in the U.S. Let me start with you, if you don't mind, Ms. Weingarten, on
Sure.
our first questions. Okay, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said that the pandemic's impact on education is, quote, a generational catastrophe that could waste untold human potential, undermine decades of progress, and exacerbate entrenched inequalities. What are other inequalities that impact student learning during a pandemic, and how has your organization advocated to address these challenges?
So let me, first off, you know, the Secretary General is quite right. And one of the things that is going on right now is that you've had countries around the world, you know, some countries have done a far better job than others in terms of creating trust and really understanding and being honest and transparent about the pandemic and leading with what public health authorities have told us that we should do, leading with the science and safety as opposed to downplaying the virus. Now, today is a bad day in the United States in that this new book that by Mr. Woodward have made it clear how much our president has lied and downplayed things, and that's going to make things worse, not better. Now, what we are seeing is this. Just like so much else in inequality, even though the virus has affected has maybe affected our shores at the same time in terms of the United States, it's affected people quite differently. Geographically, there's been huge differences, and demographically, there's been huge differences. And where you see the inequality play out in healthcare. Let me just talk quickly about healthcare, education, and the economy. On the economy, if you actually looked at who was unemployed, significantly more people who are Black and brown were unemployed, have been unemployed or have lost their jobs since the virus started. You see a huge difference between how the virus has affected the United States, where rich and upper middle class have done quite fine. Wall Street has done quite fine. But you're seeing millions and millions of people who are unemployed. Take the hospitality industry, for example, and 95% of the people working in the hospitality industry are still unemployed. But second, unessential workers. And I actually believe teachers are essential workers and others as well. But essential workers, that category, EMT workers, grocery store workers, healthcare workers, aides, orderlies, respiratory therapists. If you actually look, there is a disproportionate number of people who are Black and brown who are essential workers. So in terms of the economy on both sides, you have seen that that inequality reigns in terms of who has been on the front line and who has been most affected in terms of employment. In terms of schools, disproportionate number of Black and brown people, kids who have food need money from our federal government to do that. Same in terms of digital divide. 15% of our kids, mostly Black and brown and poor, still don't have digital equipment to do remote education. And in terms of healthcare, you see huge different impacts between people who are Black and brown in terms of healthcare effects and people who are not. So you see that COVID has disproportionately affected people who are Black and brown more than people who are white. Part of that is pre-existing conditions. Part of that is the nature of not having significant enough health insurance and to have dealt with health issues beforehand. So I can go on and on, but in each of those areas, you see how this inequality has really, how COVID has really affected us unequally, and as a result, kids, this is a generational change. Last thing I'll say is this: we're starting to see more and more. You know, there was initial great news that kids were very resilient to COVID, but in some of that great news, bad choices were made. Now what you're seeing in the American Pediatrics Academy has shown that there's been over 500,000 kids, of the over 6 million people who we believe have been infected with COVID, 6.4 million, 500,000 are kids. And so we have to be very, very, very careful to make sure that we are protecting children's lives while at the same time ensuring that they do not become a lost generation educationally.
Okay. Thank you for that response. And let me just do a quick follow-up on another statement and action that the Secretary General just launched a new policy brief on education and COVID-19. This calls for action in 4 key areas. Firstly, the reopening of schools, which you mentioned a bit. Secondly, prioritizing education and financing decisions. Thirdly, targeting the hardest to reach. And lastly, embracing the future of education as a springboard for the SDGs. What recommendations and resources has your organization produced to assist with education during the pandemic? I guess you sort of talked a little bit about that, but if you could just...
Yeah. So we have a lot of information that we have produced during this period of time. We are actually doing work every single day on this, from webinars to using our Share My Lesson platform, which is, you know, when the internet is working, it is easy to get to. It's sharemylesson.org, and we have made it free for everyone. So you do not have to be a member to use and access our Share My Lesson platform, and it has materials from, you know, how to prepare, how to open your computer, how to prepare remote lessons, tricks of the trade, lots of different teachers helping each other. So that's number one. Number two, we are doing all sorts of things in terms of webinars on how to help make sure that schools are safe, what we need to do that, to all of the instruction pieces. And in fact, we are having another one of these webinars this Saturday afternoon. We try to do it at different times to make sure that our members and others can go to them. We have a town hall now it used to be every Tuesday, now it's every other Tuesday, in terms of making sure that we can have interactive conversations with people on this. And all of this material, I can go on and on. We also do a huge amount of advocacy in terms of trying.
I think hers is freezing up again. Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing that information with us, and I know your schedule. Hopefully you'll stay as long as possible. At this point, thank you so much for that information, yes. Ms. McCurn, can you respond to the issue of the inequalities and how your organization is addressing that?
Sure. So girls, children from ethnic minorities, children with disabilities, those from the poorest communities, children who are facing emergencies. Prior to COVID-19, those children faced really considerable, significant barriers in accessing quality education. And now those marginalized groups, they're the ones that are least likely to have internet connectivity. They're the least likely to have a personal computer or a radio or television at home, which means that those already vulnerable groups are missing out on a lot of the remote learning opportunities that are available. But even when children do have access to those technologies, we see that there are other disadvantages that they face. For example, in a lot of countries, we're noticing that girls take on additional domestic responsibilities. So they might have take the responsibility of taking care of sick relatives or younger children, household chores, so they have less time to devote to remote learning. Similarly, children who don't have significant parental support because their parents are working, they don't have parents, or their parents don't have high levels of education or any level of education, those children are also at a disadvantage. So we've seen really throughout the entire response that UNICEF has worked hard to make sure that those vulnerable children are kept at the center of the response. And this has involved working closely with governments around the world to support them in developing different types of delivery channels for remote learning. Because we know that not all children have access to digital learning, there have to be alternatives, whether it's radio or television or self-learning packets, so that all children can be reached. And now as schools are starting to reopen, UNICEF has become very involved in making sure that there are strategies that governments are implementing to make sure that they are reaching out to the most vulnerable children and bringing them back to the classroom. Because we know from experience, the Ebola crisis in West Africa is an example that disruptions in education can signal the end of schooling for many children. So we want to make sure that there are strategies in place to bring those children back to school and to support them with remedial learning when they are back in the classroom. So for example, in Madagascar, UNICEF has supported a nationwide back to school campaign that is focused on targeting the hardest to reach children that are most likely to drop out permanently, and then supporting them with catch-up classes so they can mitigate any lost learning and catch up to their peers when they are back in school. And just the last thing I'll mention is that we hear a lot from the UN talk about building back better and reimagining education. And what that really means is creating more equitable and inclusive education systems that really do address the needs of all of these vulnerable children that were left out of any type of educational progress that was made prior to COVID-19. So that's really that pro-equity approach is really the cornerstone of UNICEF's education vision.
Great, thank you so much. And Dr. Tawil, if you could respond to not only the inequalities issues, but also the Secretary General's policy brief. If you turn your mic on.
Sure. Sure. Actually, UNESCO was very much involved in developing that brief with other partners. But I think what we heard first, I mean, if anything, COVID-19 has exposed inequalities at all levels. Colleagues have mentioned we had an educational or a learning crisis prior to the to COVID-19, and the closure of schools and the disruption of learning has been exacerbating these in different ways. And I think the first impact, and in all cases, it's the most vulnerable in the sense of the poorest households, single parent households, minorities, girls in particular. But there's an immediate impact which is really on health and on nutrition. I mean, even in terms of interruption of schooling, I think we realized immediately that it's also an interruption of a set of services. So in terms of nutrition and school feeding programs, and I'm not only referring to countries, in the South. I mean, the number and the share of families that depend on school feeding programs or discounted meals at school. And there is an estimate now of 370 million learners who are missing out on school meals, that families are struggling to put food on the table. And that even between last year and this year, the number of kids that go hungry in the world as a result of this, as the result of the disruption of school feeding programs, is likely to double. There are the other, health, well-being, protection factors that colleagues referred to as well. I mean, schooling and education is also protection, a safe space, and that there are, it's a way of guarding against excessive child work, if not child labor, and in the case of adolescent girls, some form of protection from potential violence or early pregnancy, or, as was mentioned, engagement in home care and family chores. So there's first and foremost the health and well-being. I mean, the interruption and disruption of education has an impact immediately on that, and then it has an impact on learning. We speak a lot of learning loss, but there's also a high risk of non-return and dropout. Even here in France, with the start of the new school year, it's too early to say, and it's too early to say for the 3/4 of the school systems starting their new year, but we will certainly have lost students during this period for a combination of reasons. Family reasons, but also we know from research that interruptions in the educational process and even scheduled summer breaks have an impact potentially on dropout. And even those who return, there will be a process of disengagement for those who were on the margins of the educational process in any case, who were behind, who did not have the proper family support. Looking longer term and in terms of development efforts, definitely this will have an impact on the efforts that have been made, the investments that have been made in education in terms of social and economic development. So yes, a potential of a lost generation. We're now in a situation also with the reopening that things are very, as we know, uncertain. Even the guidance that we have in terms of public health and the medical advice the way to translate into, you know, into the school setting varies across countries, even within the same region. So we're all struggling you know, with the reopening, and there's uncertainty about it. I mean, in many cases, schools have reclosed in certain districts and localities. The longer the interruption, the worse the impact at all levels. The immediate impact on health, the immediate impact on learning, and the longer term impact on prospects for individuals and families, future and collective efforts in social and economic development.
Okay, thank you so much. And Mr. Deeb, if you can just respond to the inequalities, but more so to the Secretary General's policy brief, and what do you see as some of the outcomes or the necessary or the most important elements of that?
Yes, thank you, and thanks to colleagues actually highlighted a lot of multifold inequalities that we call it actually, in terms of challenge of accessibility and in terms of inability of parents or caregivers actually to fully support or replace a teacher. We all agree that the home can never replace the school, particularly, you see, we are speaking of COVID implications where parents and in most cases, the students are in confinement. So we used to say education emergency. This time we're saying education in confinement, maybe because it's much, you see, more difficult and more challenging to the education system. Now, in focusing more in this context on the refugee community, a joint effort actually of research between the American University of Beirut did a survey study on the socioeconomic situation of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And one of the results was that this was in 2010, is that 66% of Palestinian refugees are living beyond the poverty line. This research or survey was repeated into 2015 and the same result actually. As colleagues mentioned, COVID increased unemployment, and already the refugees in Lebanon, take into consideration that they are deprived of their civil rights actually in Lebanon, increased unemployment more and more among them, reached around 80% actually these days among refugees, which creates more and more challenge at the socioeconomic level of the refugees, which impacts actually the standard of living and you see the psychosocial situation of parents and the students. Now, the most dangerous, as colleagues mentioned, is and this is, I think, what the Secretary General warns about the catastrophe of the dropping out based on the UNESCO report that 25 million are at risk of dropping out because of COVID-19. So it's excluding the community. Excluded community is an issue actually, community of students particularly, and even the parents. We are speaking of students who may not, let's take the example of the students with disabilities, let's say. While at school, we face difficulty in mainstreaming students with disabilities and learning difficulties. So speaking with about students at home actually increases the difficulty of referrals, difficulty of following up and providing support. Though UNRWA, in its remote learning program, what we call the self-learning program actually that responded particularly in March till June to provide remote learning, took into consideration to support not only student learning, but to support also families to build their capacities. And this is an important point here, and lesson learned is to take into consideration building capacity of all stakeholders actually, because we are speaking of a completely different modalities, particularly the remote learning or even the blended learning in case we will use this modality. Developing the capacity of teachers on how to support the children while at home, developing capacity of school principals, school leaders actually, and the parents themselves because they should have different roles now in terms of supporting their children while at home. All of these difficulties that the Secretary General referred to in his brief policy actually should be taken into consideration, and I think UNRWA is looking into quality education. UNRWA is seeking to provide equality in education, actually, because equality linked to the SDG 4, not only SDG 4 by itself, but it accelerates even the achievement of other sustainable development goals. So these are issues, I think, common everywhere, and UNRWA, even I can give you the example of the SLP self-learning program that implemented. We did a survey, a quick survey. We found that around 30% were not able to join, actually, vulnerable students, because of lack of digital devices or because of demotivation of their parents actually to join such program, or because of lack of internet or cost of internet. And UNRWA organized during summer like a catch-up summer program for these 30% to ensure equality actually for all students to have the similar practices and experiences. Take into consideration that this program may be repeated, and we will repeat it at least in the beginning of the coming school year.
Great, thank you so much. Oh, great, thank you so much for the responses. For these general questions, of course, the Secretary General has set the pattern in terms of what we should be considering, especially in that policy statement. I'd like to now, we're going to turn it over and see whether we have questions from our audience, and we'll direct those to the individual panelists. So Anna, do we have a question ready?
Yes, we had a few questions come in, of course, about the inequalities discussion, but also about, Caitlin mentioned Build Back Better and the UN's effort to build back better. And so the question is really, what types of lessons can be learned and changes can be made for the future, not just to implement during the pandemic, but practices of addressing inequalities, addressing virtual learning that we can implement for the future going forward.
Okay, Caitlin, Ms. McCurn, you want to start that off since we're piggybacking on your statement?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of important lessons that are coming out of COVID-19. We're learning from our research that a lot of children don't have access to the internet and don't have access to digital learning opportunities. Access is uneven across countries, within countries, in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Less than 2% of children have access to the internet in their houses. And this is important because what we're also learning is that children that do have access to the internet in their homes have higher foundational reading skills. And what this means is that digital learning solutions, if they're well designed and have engaging content, that they have real potential to support students in some of the most vulnerable places in the world. So even after the pandemic, there'll be emergencies, refugees, there'll be situations where schools will be closed again. So if we can really harness all of these lessons that we're learning, then we can support some of the most vulnerable children in the world with digital learning solutions. But that really requires accelerating our work and expanding access to online learning opportunities. So UNICEF has been doing a bit of this work prior to COVID-19. In 2019, UNICEF and the International Telecommunications Union launched an initiative called GIGA, which is seeking to expand connectivity using schools as a base point in countries around the world. So this is also part of a larger global initiative called Learning Unlimited that is seeking to reach 3.5 billion children across 190 countries with internet connectivity or digital learning solutions by 2030. So the digital space is important. There's a lot that can be done there that we're learning from COVID. But there are a lot of changes we can make within schools as we're bringing children back into the school system, infrastructure changes to make schools more appropriate for children with disabilities. A lot of these techniques that are being used now to bring children back to school, like back to school enrollment campaigns and remedial courses. The idea is to bring kids back to school after COVID, but ideally we bring back children who had stopped attending school long before the pandemic. So those are just some of the ways that I think we can build stronger education systems as we look to really recover from COVID-19.
Great, thank you. I'd like to bring Dr. Tawil in on this one with UNESCO, and that's what a lot of UNESCO has been doing over the years. Dr. Tawil?
Sure, thanks. True, I think, you know, from having started in March by tracking, you know, this unprecedented, you know, spread and scale of school closures and interruptions. I mean, the first thing was to kind of ring the alarm bell on the possible consequences, immediate and longer term. There was initially also, you know, from the technology side, maybe a more optimistic view initially of saying, well, the closure of schools has actually forced innovation and will finally allow us to move, you know, away from the you know, the factory model of the 19th century. But 6 months down the line, with varied success of combining different technologies and remote learning, I think one thing that has become clear for all is that the human factor is essential. And that's the human factor, and that's also the social space of the school. That the importance of that social space, the importance of interaction with peers, with teachers, with others, and with the school community. So I think now, as we look at, you know, hybrid models and looking to the future, there is that the importance and maybe rebalancing what is important in the social space of the school and in human contact with others. There's some learning when the remote learning, you know, when the conditions are there for some remote learning, there's some learning that can be done at a distance more appropriately, but there's this important socialization function of schooling, which cannot be done remotely. The second aspect of the human contact is the teachers, and I think we heard it at the very beginning. I mean, frontline workers like health workers and others, that teachers are essential, and that if there has been a lot of innovation during this period, it's been done also by teachers who have been engaged, and we must give teachers not only, you know, the value the profession and you know, the respect that I think we've discovered the importance of teachers in our society, and that giving these frontline educators more autonomy and flexibility to also you know, work collaboratively and innovatively has been. There is a longer term lesson, which is less in terms of you know, the immediate needs and response, but what we've seen over the past 6 months is an increased reliance of public education systems on commercial technical platforms.
Yeah.
And this poses a problem for principles of the right to education, our commitments globally within the SDGs to free public education. And these are issues that will have to be looked at you know, in terms of the governance and the regulation of you know, of not only the platforms that are being used, but the digital tools and resources, many of which are, you know, not necessarily quality ensured, and which are commercial. One of the things that UNESCO did from the outset was to actually develop a repository, first of national distance learning platforms, in a spirit of peer learning. What are countries actually establishing as a form of, and we have among others, the self-learning program of UNRWA as examples of what these platforms and programs look like for just to exchange that experience, but also a repository of digital resources of different types. It's not always easy to disentangle what is free from what is private. A lot of the free and commercial offerings, a lot of the private and commercial offerings were made free for certain periods of time in this pandemic. In need, there has been recourse to them. But as I said, down the line, there is an issue about how we will protect also the idea of public education when there is increasing involvement of commercial interests in many cases.
Sure, thank you so much. And Anna, we'll have time for one more question.
Yes, we had a question come in from Zara Khan that I think would be perfect for Mr. Deeb about mental health. I know we featured UNRWA's work with Palestinian youth in providing mental health support, and would love to hear other ways or best practices, because the COVID-19 impact is not just the impact on physical distancing, but of course social and mental health as well.
Great. Okay, Mr. Deeb.
Yes,
good.
Thank you. Actually, within the self-learning program I mentioned, part of it was actually we have in the system school counselors who continue to support the children while at home through care calls and through counseling sessions and through awareness sessions to their parents, actually in terms of hygiene practices and guidance on how to take care of their children learning. UNRWA in this context worked as agency actually on many guides for teachers, many guides for parents, and even MHPSS guide actually developed to address coping with COVID-19. So in this context, actually agency, while I'm speaking, not only in Lebanon, we have a task force at the agency level and task force at the field levels actually, who put in place these guides actually, building capacity of school counselors and the psychosocial supporters to take care of the well-being of children. So this was part of our self-learning program, and a lot of activities actually has been done in this context to make sure that you see promoting the not only self-learning, but the well-being of the children while at home.
Okay, thank you. And Anna, we have time for one more question.
This question was submitted early on by Dr. Tamimi about how UNRWA as a US constituency can support your agencies. And so maybe it's a good opportunity for everyone to quickly answer just how UNRWA can continue to support your work.
Okay. Caitlin, would you like to take this one with UNICEF? Because we're all in the UN family.
Sure. So UNICEF USA has a Uniters network that is networks of supporters across the United States that volunteer their time in different ways. They get involved in advocacy issues affecting children. They support UNICEF in raising funds for different UNICEF programs. There are a number of different channels through the Unite Club that other interested United States citizens can get involved in supporting UNICEF's work. So I'd be happy to share a little bit more information, follow up with you so you can understand how to get involved in that program.
Great, and the same thing with UNESCO and certainly with our work with the refugees. Well, we want to thank our panelists and for all that you shared with us, and certainly thank your organizations for the great work they are doing. There is something that we can do right here and right now to help ensure all children around the world have access to a quality education. The United Nations and its agencies have long taken a leading role in dedicating vast resources to guaranteeing that every person has access to a quality education. By doing so, we could lift 170 million people out of poverty if all students learn basic reading skills. We're counting on you to support the UN's work in bringing partners together to secure quality education for all as we move towards 2030 and work towards achieving the global goals. You can also do this by supporting the UNAUSA's advocacy petition by texting the word education to the number 738-674. 738-674 would be your text. You'll then receive a form to fill out to urge your members of Congress to support the UN's efforts. There are many more ways that you can take action, certainly as a member of UNAUSA. So when you join with us, you're joining 20,000 other Americans around the country who know the importance of the United Nations and who also partner with all of the organizations that you've heard speaking on this program. We've joined UNA because we understand that America and the world need the United Nations to support quality education as a human right. So join us by becoming a member of and a UN advocate at unausa.org. And finally, please join us for more upcoming UNA events and video recordings of our Global Summit sessions, which are listed on our website. As we close this important session on ensuring quality education in the times of COVID-19, we move forward recognizing the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, recognizing the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, recognizing 25 years after the Beijing Women's Conference, and 55 years after the Voting Rights Act, all historical mileposts for our society's march toward equality. Your joining us today is testament that we continue to march on with strengthened commitment, untiring encouragement, and renewed dedication to what Eleanor Roosevelt, the founder of the United Nations Association, called civic action for change, social justice, equality, human rights. So finally, we thank our distinguished panel, and we thank all of you for joining us today. Have a good day. Thank you. This ends our session.
Thank you.